member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I support the amendment. And in the great filing cabinet of Commonwealth law, the bill itself, this bill, to which the member for Hunter has moved an amendment, the bill goes into the drawer marked "stupid mistakes with terrible consequences." It's a bill that recreates an Inspector General of live animal exports. Why? To provide oversight of the live export industry. When did the government figure out that that was such a brilliant idea? How many animal welfare atrocities was it going to take? How much evidence do they need of awful conduct and hopeless regulation of this industry, especially in relation to the export of live sheep? As everyone in the debate so far has acknowledged, 6 years ago, in 2013, the then Labor government created an interim Inspector General of Animal Welfare and an Australian Animal Welfare Advisory Committee, and the newly elected coalition government decided to get rid of both of those things. It was an extraordinarily stupid thing to do, an extraordinarily stupid thing to do. It is hard to understand how they made that decision. The only way you can partly understand, I think, is that the responsible minister at the time was the member for New England. The responsible member, the member for New England at the time, in explaining why the interim inspector of animal welfare had to go, said that it had only been introduced, and I quote, so that people would feel a sense of solace in the urban areas, because they'll say, oh, well, that sounds great, but when you peel back the onion, you say, well, you're really just putting a policeman on a policeman. The first policeman will do the job very well. Let the first policeman do the job. You don't need to have policeman on policeman, otherwise it becomes a ludicrous extension, said the member for New England. Why don't we get an auditor for the auditor just in case the auditor's not doing his job? Then we'll get an auditor for that auditor so the auditor's not doing its job and we can go on forever. It's like Kafka, he said. How ridiculous. What was the basis for saying that? The interim inspector for animal welfare was put in place with a very clear purpose. The purpose was to oversight the regulation of the live export industry. The mistake the government made was about as obvious as they come, and that has been clear every day through the last 6 years, and it was made crystal clear by the review undertaken by Mr Philip Moss after we'd seen atrocity on atrocity in relation to the live sheep export trade. The review by Mr Philip Moss, titled Regulatory Capability and Culture of the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources in the Regulation of Live Animal Exports, which the member for Barker should take some time and read at some point, identified a series of ways in which getting rid of the Inspector General of Animal Welfare was a profoundly stupid thing to do. We've known for a long time that live export is inherently dangerous for animals, that it's likely to produce animal suffering, and that when you transport sheep in decrepit old ships for weeks on end to the hottest part of the world at the hottest time of the year, animal suffering is guaranteed. A Senate report back in 1985 said the trade, in many respects, is inimical to good animal welfare. And the Moss Review, 32 years later, found, by its nature, live animal exports presents a high risk to animal health and welfare. We know from the heat stress review that's not been made public that our previous approach, which was to measure suffering only through the death rate of animals, was wrong. Sheep are hardy animals. I've had sheep farmers from around Australia be in contact with me on this issue, and that's a point they often make. Lots of sheep have made it to the Middle East, having been put through pain and suffering that vets and the Australian public rightly find absolutely unacceptable. We also know that there's an inherent conflict in a department that's responsible for promoting agriculture and related trade and also responsible for animal welfare. Those two things do not always pull in the same direction. There are aspects of primary production and trade that work against the humane treatment of animals. That much is obvious. That's where the member for New England, so many of his colleagues have gone badly wrong. It's not the case of having an auditor for an auditor It's a case of having an independent person who's charged with a pure focus on animal welfare, being responsible for overseeing a bureaucracy that has conflicting imperatives. We know the regulatory approach itself was structurally flawed. Vets accredited by the government to be responsible for animal welfare were employed by the live exporters. It doesn't take a genius to realise that people in that circumstance are going to be compromised. The Moss Review noted, although on-board AAVs are accredited by and report to the department, they're employed by the exporter. This role appears to be inherently conflicted, and so it was. We know there were cultural problems in the department. That seems to offend the member for Barker. We know there were cultural problems in the department and that there'd been a loss of animal welfare expertise. That was led by this government. That cultural problem and that irresponsibility started with this government. It started with the minister, the member for New England, and it was enabled by everybody else around him. The Moss Review said, currently there's a lack of focus on and expertise in animal welfare. The department does not have a single regulatory mindset. And finally, Deputy Speaker, we know that the approach of the department and of the industry in general to the contribution of animal welfare organisations was massively unhelpful. And this is the quote from the Moss Review that the members for O'Connor and Barker should pay some close attention to. This is what Mr Moss said. Animal welfare organisations play a significant role in the regulatory framework because, through the resourcing they dedicate to monitoring, they are a significant source of information about animal health and welfare in the context of live animal exports. Consistent with good regulatory practice, the department needs to improve its connection with this sector. The re-establishment of an animal welfare branch in the department would help to address this issue. So we've had the member for Barker come in. I didn't know, at some points I felt like I'd sort of fallen asleep and woken up through a lecture about the assassination of JFK or the moon landing, as if these things are all part of a pattern of fakery, that the footage that we saw of the Awasi Express has somehow been made up and it never really happened, and the live export trade, the live export of sheep, is actually perfectly okay. I mean, don't forget that there have been more than 100 voyages in which more than 1,000 sheep have died. There's been incident after incident after incident. The Awasi Express is only the most recent. But we still have members of the government not prepared to address the cultural problem in the government, blaming animal welfare organisations. There's nothing wrong with the trade, it's the animal welfare organisations that have somehow concocted video footage of animals literally dying by drowning in their own waste. You know, that is ridiculous. So, an obvious mistake, a stupid mistake with terrible consequences. What consequences? We know that the ships being operated were unfit for transport. The department has belatedly admitted to that. We know there were falsified vet reports, right? An outcome directly affected by the fact that authorised vets were employed by the exporters. We know there was chronic departmental inaction in the face of clear breaches of regulation and clear instances of animal welfare abuse. We know there was enormous and relentless suffering inflicted on animals. In 2014, 4,000 sheep died on a trip from Fremantle to Qatar. In 2016, 3,000 sheep died on another Emmanuel export voyage. And then in 2017, the Awasi Express, 2,500 sheep. Since this trade began, the live sheep export trade, terrible, decrepit, converted car carriers taking tens of thousands of sheep at the hottest time of the year to the hottest part of the world in awful, unregulated conditions. 200 million sheep have gone from Australia into the Middle East. 3 million have died. And let's not make the mistake of assuming that only the 3 million that died suffered, because there will be millions and millions and millions of sheep that got off at the other end, barely alive, that went through an experience that the Australian public rightly finds utterly, utterly unacceptable. And there is no sliding scale on which the suffering of animals becomes acceptable at some price. Deputy Speaker, it is true that apart from the animal welfare suffering that has occurred through this industry and enabled by this government, other people have been harmed as well. Farmers have been harmed, farming communities have been harmed, other people involved in the production chain. That is an important part of the story. They are people in my home state of Western Australia, and I have sympathy for those on the land who had every right to expect a regulatory system that would keep the export industry to high and rigorous standards, and that didn't happen. Exporters pulled the wool over their eyes and over the eyes of the regulators, but the regulators weren't looking hard enough. And that's something that people involved in the industry, the farmers, feed producers, truck drivers and the communities in which they live need to be clear-eyed about. I speak to representatives of primary producers. I speak to the peak bodies. I speak to truck drivers and their representatives. I speak to individual farmers. And when I do that, I tell them straight. I say to them, you've been let down by your representative groups. You've been let down by your representative groups, and you've been let down by some of your representatives in this place, because they ignored the clear signs of a rotten industry. They ignored them, and they lied to the people that they are supposed to be representing, their constituents, whether they're representatives in this place or whether they're peak bodies. They cheered on this government when it took away those regulatory protections. They didn't say, hang on a second, those regulatory protections are important to us, they're part of our social licence, we care about our animals, we want our industry to be, what is it they say these days? Stable and... Sustainable? No, stable and certain government. Oh, stable and certain industry, yeah? We'd like to have a stable and certain industry, so don't go and ransack the important regulatory protections in the name of your red tape reduction jihad or whatever it is you're on this week, because that will put us at risk. But not enough people said that. Not enough farmers said that. Not enough truck drivers said that, and none of the peak bodies said that. None of the representative groups said, you are going to go and do harm to us. But that's what's happened. Some of those groups have been guilty of exactly the same structural and cultural problems that affected the Department of Agriculture, and they should be big enough to look themselves in the mirror and admit that. Some of them have been too quick to say, exactly as the member for O'Connor and the member for Barker said, there's nothing wrong with this industry, there's nothing wrong with millions of sheep suffering and millions of sheep dying. It's all the animal welfare activists concocting some weird videos. I mean, how ridiculous. There's nothing hard and there's nothing courageous about playing to the crowd. There's nothing hard and there's nothing courageous about standing up and telling people what they want to hear. And there are some people who have been involved in this trade for a long time who should have a bit more courage and should be prepared to say to people involved in this trade, we've let you down. It's been a rotten trade and we've enabled it, because that is the truth. Deputy Speaker, the people in the broader community have been very clear. They've spoken up and they've said this is wrong and it's got to stop. And they're not just people in cities, they're not just beard-wearing, cold coffee brew drinking inner city hipsters. They are all over this country. I've been contacted by people outside Western Australia, which is really principally the only place that live sheep happens, who have said this has to stop. I've been contacted by plenty of farmers, and certainly plenty of sheep farmers, who have said I would never subject my animals to that kind of treatment. This has to stop. They are bringing us all down. They are bringing down responsible agricultural producers, and people in that space. Some of the people who were involved and benefited from it, they enabled the harm. The harm was not created by animal activists. It wasn't created by the Labor Party or any members in this place who spoke up in the absolutely rightful cause of proper regulation. It was created by the industry, by the exporters in particular, and by people on that side, by this government, who stupidly and wantonly took away protection that should always have been maintained. So where are we now? The government, belatedly, half-heartedly, 6 years on, dragged to put back something that was there 6 years ago. We know that the cessation of the trade does not bring ruin to the farming sector in Western Australia. It has had impacts, and that's difficult, and I feel for the people who have been on the receiving ends. But we've had 2 summers when the trade has dropped away, and the suggestion by some that it would lead to some kind of widespread ruin in Western Australia has not proved to be true. The live sheep trade continues to decline. It is terminal. The export of boxed meat and chilled carcasses to the Middle East continues to grow. That's our future. That's the future of the trade. It's a future with higher value-added exports, more jobs in Australia, and most of all, better animal welfare outcomes. We have the prospect of moving out of the live sheep trade altogether. We know it's possible. We know it's necessary. It's going to take leadership and courage. We've shown that. It's about time some people on that side stood up and did that as well.